you'll notice that this past Sunday, what we're going to do tonight, I'm kind of recap some things that I talked about on Sunday morning. Don't worry, I'm not re-preaching my whole sermon, but I just want to kind of hit some highlights. And we're going to take some time to discuss some of the questions that I've put down there for us. Some of those that I've kind of come up with based upon the things that I taught from Henry Blackaby's material. But some of these questions are questions that Blackaby himself, from his study, I pulled from for us to talk about. So introducing it this last week, if you remember, there are, for those of you who have not ever done this study, there are 7 realities that he calls 7 truths or realities of experiencing God, of which around this whole study revolves. And this last week we looked at number 1, which is that God is always at work around you. And we kind of broke down what that sentence means and what he means by that. And there's lots of biblical principles to pull from. But I started off on Sunday by saying that the way that we experience God, or however we experience God, is largely determined by the way that we view him. And here's just a little recap of some of the thoughts that I brought in the introductory part of the message. That if we view God primarily as a lofty God who is transcendent above us, who is the awesome almighty God that we worship, the one who demands to be worshiped, which he does, all that being true. But if we do that to the exclusion of a God who is also very eminently and intricately and intimately involved in our lives, the personal God, to the exclusion of that, then we might tend to see him as someone who is reluctant to come among us, to answer our prayers, someone who has to be coaxed by our prayers to care about our needs. And this is not the God of the Bible, of course. And even someone that we might end up becoming distant with, someone that we also, a God that we might insulate ourselves in a false humility by worshiping God who is lofty and high and above us, but unintentionally or intentionally insulate ourselves from that God getting too close to us so that he can mess up our lives, right? So that would be the negative version of that. On the opposite end, there's also the possibility that I've seen in my own life at times, and probably you might have struggled with as well. We can do the opposite. That we make God so close to us, that we make him our buddy and our friend, so much to the point that we reduce God down to that level, and we forget that he is Lord, and that he has claims on our life, and he has the authority to tell us what to do. And so we need to keep these things in balance, right? And so that view of God, however you see God, and depending on where you might fall on that spectrum, will largely determine on whether or not you're listening to him. And when you listen to him, if you hear him speak to you, your response to him, and whether he is able to direct your life. God is not static. He's not a stoic God. He's very much dynamic and alive and present. And he is on a mission. He is always working on a mission to redeem and reconcile lost people in the world. He desires to accomplish his mission by working through us. Could God go out and save people on his own? Yes. And sometimes he does. He claims people for himself. But we know that biblically, the way that the New Testament especially lays it out, the Great Commission that Jesus gave us, is that he chooses to use servants like us, his disciples, to go out and be his witnesses and to work through us to accomplish his purposes. One of the biblical characters that we looked at on Sunday, of which Blackaby really draws heavily from to these principles, come from the story of Moses. And in Exodus 2, 21 through 25 was the text that we looked at on Sunday. And I'm going to read that for you. I didn't put it on here, so if you have a Bible, you can turn there with me. I'm going to read it real quick for us again, just to remind us of what this says. And this comes at the end of chapter 2, which is the early part of Moses' life when he was found in the basket reed in the Nile River by the Pharaoh's daughter and was brought into the Pharaoh's household and was raised in the Egyptian household. And then he fled Egypt, of course, after he murdered the slave master who Saul beating one of his Israelite brothers. And it was after a long period of time in the desert that he landed in Midian, that we're told, again in verse 20, beginning in verse 21, Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become an alien in a foreign land. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of God, their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. And a couple of simple points that I wanted to draw out of those verses is that Moses, at this point in his life in a foreign land, was probably unaware that God was listening to the prayers of the Israelites and that God was planning something and that he was already at work and he was already answering those prayers. And he was also unaware that he too would become the answer to some of those prayers himself. I didn't draw this out in my message on Sunday, but I want you to think about that thought just for a second. Could it be that you might be an answer to someone's prayers that you don't know have been prayed? A prayer that has not yet been answered because possibly God is positioning you at some point in the near future to be an answer to someone's prayer in terms of bringing them a witness for Christ, ministering to them in some way, being a source of encouragement on some level for the Lord. That's a pretty staggering thought, isn't it? Much less to do something on the level or the magnitude of how God used Moses to redeem and rescue an entire nation. I'm looking across all of us in this room. Could any of us imagine God using us into that level? Certainly Moses thought the same thing. The question is, are we saying, and this will be a part of our discussion, one of the questions, that if we say, well, that's impossible, well, that's just not realistic. What Blackaby has reminded us and what he has said is, you've just said more about your faith in God than you have about yourself. It's a pretty challenging thought, isn't it, to think about that. But God is on a mission, and he was already up to something before Moses was ever aware of it. He is around us all the time working, and he's always trying to involve us in his work, and he's speaking, and he's still doing it, calling people, sending people, using people to share the gospel, to bring lost to himself. You never find God asking people to dream up what they want to do for him. That's a penetrating statement for me. Especially challenging for me as a church leader and as a pastor, because how easy it is to fall into that way of thinking. It's a dangling carrot, a diamond-crusted carrot, someone said, dangling out in front of you as a church leader to try to dream up wonderful plans and things to do for God. But Blackaby reminds us this is not the biblical pattern, that God's servants were people who waited on God and listened to him, and then they simply obeyed and trusted God. The truth that God is always at work around us, Blackaby lays out 4 or 5 ways that really the biblical responses to that. And you see this here at the bottom of on the first part of the page. First of all, we've got to believe that God is actually at work. Do we really believe it? Do I believe that right now God is working all around us and me, in my life, trying to involve me in something that maybe he has not yet revealed to me, or maybe he is beginning to reveal to me, but am I really paying attention? The second thing is, once I begin to really believe that and trust and put my faith in him, will I submit myself, my life, my dreams, goals, plans, everything that I thought I wanted for my life, everything that you're thinking about for your life now? All the things that you're planning to do tonight when you get home, all the things that you're planning to do tomorrow on your calendar or next year, your bank account, your calendar, all of your relationships. Now, this is challenging. Are we willing to place all of that on the altar? And then the next phase, if we get to the point of submitting our lives to that degree, is then God gets us in a place where we're willing to trust him. And sometimes he might test our faith in a period of waiting, where we wait on God to show us where he is at work and what he is saying to us. God, yes, he has something for us to do, but God is also as much interested in the relationship with us. We're really going to drill down on that this Sunday and next Wednesday night, about the relationship piece, the love relationship that God wants to have with each of us. That it's not just about him getting us to do something for him. He very much wants to simply have a relationship with us. But that relationship, he also has things in mind to do with us and through us. And are we willing to wait for him to show that to us? And then as we wait and submit it to him, we begin to watch We open our spiritual eyes. We ask God to open our spiritual eyes to see what He's doing around us in the relationships that we have, in everyday life, everyday encounters and conversations. It's kind of like the old game, the connecting the dots. You know, you remember that game where they're numbered and you begin to draw lines from one number to the next, and eventually by the end of it, you have a picture that comes into view. It's kind of that same picture here. You begin to watch and see what God does next, and you begin to make these spiritual connections through trusting and listening to God, and He begins to bring a picture in front of us that this is what I've called you to do. This is your purpose. And once He begins to show us that, then we join Him through obedience. When you believe that nothing significant can happen through you, you have said more about your belief in God than you have said about yourself. What are we willing to believe God to do? And then on the back, in a very similar way, another statement of Blackaby I think is also very much applicable here. If you feel weak, limited, ordinary, you are the best material through which God can work. This goes for each of us individually, but I also believe this goes for churches as well. Every church has a purpose. Every one of us has a purpose, but as a church, we have a purpose. And God has specific things in mind for us to do. And if we feel like there are things that limit us, that's okay. God is bigger, right? God has not asked us to create or do work for Him, but rather to simply come to Him, to trust in Him, rely on Him, rest in Him, and then let Him do His work through us as we obey Him. And I concluded by this verse, I think that Paul succinctly puts this whole idea, and that is, it is God who works in you, both to will and to act according to His good purpose. He is at work around us, but God is also at work in us to will and to act according to His good purpose. It sounds very similar to Romans 8:28. Y'all know that verse? That God makes all things work together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So we trust in God, and then God begins to, as we allow Him to work in and through us in His own ways. Now, I'm going to pause here, and believe it or not, yes, I am about to release you to do some discussion. You've got 23 minutes. This is like a record for me. So we've got 23 minutes for us to discuss these questions, but you're going to need it because these are some heavy-hitting questions. The first one is a very simple one, though. It's just I want you to share around the table, maybe something that you heard on Sunday, but just being reminded of tonight, or something that you saw printed on the page, or for those of you who have done this study before in the past, some truth principles that you remember that God used in your own life that impacted you maybe at another time when you did it, and to share about those. And then how does our view of God determine our experience of Him, and how do you tend to view God, if you're willing to share a little bit about that? And how does this week's truth, God is always at work around you, inform or challenge or encourage your view of God? And then, based on those 5 things I just shared about Blackaby's response to God's work around us, which one do you find easier steps for you or more difficult steps to take? Where are you in that process with your own relationship with God? And then here, I hope that you don't get too bogged down in those first few questions, because I really do want you to get to this next one. And this is a Blackaby question, directly out of his study. What are you doing in your life personally or in your church that you know cannot be accomplished unless God intervenes? Could much of what we are doing in our lives or in our churches be done without reference to God at all? When we finish a task and feel frustrated that lasting spiritual fruit is not visible, could the reason be that we are attempting very little that only God could do? And then, related to that question, share how you or we might need to trust God more rather than our own ideas, plans, and I should add strength, wisdom, whatever, creativity to do work for God. So take just a few moments to share around your table these questions. And you natural-born leader types at the table, don't sit there like a wallflower. Y'all help your table get in this discussion, and then I'll close it out in just a little while. Okay?